Okay, moving on with population, I like to talk about demographic cycles. This is called the demographic transition model or demographic cycle model, and it has four different stages. And this is a model that links population with development. And we will revisit this model a little later on in the semester, but I want to give you an introduction to it now. And as I said, it has four different stages, and the assumption is that countries move through these stages. In the high stationary stage, which is stage one, you have high birth rates and you have high death rates. High birth rates and high death rates. So you have a lot of people being born and you have a lot of people dying. So you have a relatively stationary population. In stage two, you still have a high birth rate, but the death rate begins to fall. Now, if you have a high birth rate, but the death rate begins to fall, then what does that mean for the population? Well, that means the population is going to grow or expand, and that's why it's called early expanding. So again, stage one, high stationary, you have high birth rates, high death rates. Stage two, you have high birth rates, but the death rate begins to fall, resulting in an expanding population. In stage three, the birth rates are still high in the beginning of stage three, but then the birth rates begin to fall in the latter part of stage three. So it's kind of a transition stage. The death rates continue to fall. So again, the birth rates are high in the beginning of stage three, and then they begin to fall in the later stages of stage three. And the death rate continues to fall. So the population is expanding, but not quite as much, particularly towards the end of stage three. And in stage four, you have low birth rates as well as low death rates. So you have a stationary population again, but instead of high birth rates and death rates, as we saw in stage one, we have low birth rates and death rates. So how does this fit in to the world? Well, most people would say that all countries have moved through at least stage one. That because of some introduction to healthcare and education, although it may not necessarily be the greatest, but because of some education and healthcare, all countries have moved through stage one. And those countries that are considered developing countries, less developed countries, underdeveloped countries, would be in stage two. So stage two is where you will find those countries that are considered less developed or developing countries. Okay, so those are also the countries that would have a pyramid-shaped population pyramid, where you have a wide bottom and a narrow top. Stage three can be a little tricky because stage three could go either way. Sometimes countries will continue to develop, sometimes they won't. I put here mentefacts versus artifacts. We talked about this in the culture PowerPoints. That sometimes they may have a particular worldview, but they don't necessarily have the technology to keep up. So sometimes there can be a lag. Stage four is where you will find developed countries. So stage two and stage four are probably the more important ones out of the model to remember. That stage two is where you will find less developed countries. Stage four is where you will find developed countries. But I want you to know that this is a model. Okay, this is a model. So it's not always the most accurate in predicting demographic change, particularly in less developed countries, because there are several things that could alter that. You could have a disease outbreak, you could have a civil war, you could have a new military, you could have a change in political leadership, and that could dramatically change the stage that a country is in. It could make a country zoom through stages and develop more quickly, or it could set them back several stages. So it's not completely accurate in all cases, but it is one way to look at development. This particular development model looks at it in relation to population, but as I said, we'll revisit it again, particularly when we get to the development lectures later on. So when we think about population, these are some questions that I want you to ponder, and these will actually be questions on the discussion board. Should we inhibit population growth? If we think population growth is a problem and it's growing too quickly, should it be a global objective? And who should inhibit it? So if we decide, well, the world needs to do something about it, then who's going to do that? Whose job is that going to be? And how are we going to do that at a global level? And what about places that are losing population? How will we handle that? So would we set a global standard? And then if someone happens to be born in a country where there's a high population, too bad. You can't have any kids. But if you were lucky enough to be born in this country, you could have all you want. There are all these types of cultural, ethical types of questions that go in to these problems. These are difficult problems. So I just want you to ponder this and then chit-chat about it a little bit on the discussion board. Now I mentioned that there was one factor that played a huge role in population other than births and deaths, and that's migration. So there are a few terms I want you to be familiar with migration. Absolute and relative direction and absolute and relative distance. And these will sound very similar to absolute and relative location, one of the 5 themes that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. Absolute direction is the exact, precise direction. It can be known as the compass direction. Relative direction is the direction of a place or location relative to the direction of another place. So for example, if I say the northeastern United States, or the south, or the west, or if terms are used like the Middle East, or the Far East, those are all relative directional terms, relative to someplace else on the map. Then we have absolute and relative distance. Absolute is the exact distance in miles or kilometers or however you want to measure it. Is the exact physical distance. Relative distance has to do with time. How long does it take to get there? And just like absolute and relative location that we talked about at the beginning of the semester, one might be more important than the other depending upon what you're trying to figure out. Because in some cases, something can be 5 miles away, but take you an hour to get there. So many times in urban locations or crowded locations or during rush hour, you might be more interested in relative distance than absolute distance. We also have external versus internal migration. External migration is when you migrate outside the country. So it has to be outside country lines. Okay, not cities, not states, but you have to leave the country. Internal migration is migration within the country. So if you're moving from California to New York, that's internal migration. If you're moving from California to Mexico, that's external migration. And there are many, many different reasons why people move. This is a list of just a few catalysts of migration. This is not all the reasons people move. But many times they'll move for economic conditions, can be the overall economic climate, or can be for a particular job. Political circumstances, political unrest, armed conflict, civil war, could be environmental conditions. That could be anywhere from a big natural disaster to just preferring a particular climate for health reasons. It may have to do with culture or tradition, if people have feelings that they're losing their culture or losing tradition. Technological advances make it possible to live in areas that we may not have lived in 100 years ago. We probably wouldn't live in places that were extremely cold or extremely hot if we didn't have air conditioning and heat, for example. And just the flow of information has now allowed us to move to places that we may not have even considered before, because we didn't even know they existed or we didn't know anything about them. So these are just a few of the catalysts of migration. But all of them tend to be part of what are called push-pull factors. And a push factor is a factor that pushes you out of where you are. It is a variable that pushes you out of where you are. And a pull factor is a factor that pulls you towards someplace else. So if you think about all the moves you've had in your lifetime, there are probably things that pushed you out of where you are, and there are other things that pulled you towards another place. And sometimes there could be a combination thereof. So, for instance, just say you were offered a job in New York City, but you didn't want to leave Fresno. You liked Fresno. All things being equal, if that job was here in Fresno, you would probably stay in Fresno. But it's not. It's in New York City. So you have a pull factor of the job, but not necessarily anything about Fresno that's pushing you out. Now, in some cases, there might be just a push factor. Maybe there's some reason you want to get out of Fresno. Maybe you don't like the heat, or maybe you don't like the air quality, or maybe you don't like your in-laws. Who knows? Maybe there's something pushing you out of Fresno, but there isn't any other place that's necessarily pulling you towards it. And many times there's a combination of both. Now, sometimes we have what is called an intervening opportunity. And an intervening opportunity is something that intervenes with that initial migration plan. So just say you had that plan to move to New York City and take that job, and you started driving cross country. What could be an intervening opportunity? Well, lots of things. Maybe you didn't get that job after all. Or maybe the assumption was you graduated and you got the job, and then you find out you need 3 more units. Or maybe you ran out of money on the way there. Or maybe you met the love of your life at a rest stop halfway there and then you never left. So there's all types of things that could interfere with that initial migration plan. And that's an intervening opportunity. And geographers want to look at that. They want to know what's pushing people out of areas and what's pulling people out of areas. That's why when you see Chamber of Commerce commercials for cities, everyone's always happy, and they're playing, and they're at the beach, and they're horseback riding, and they're at amusement parks. They're having a good old time. They don't show you any of the bad stuff because they want to focus on what will pull people to the area. Now, there have been some migration streams that have clearly transformed the world. 3 big ones: Europeans moving to the New World, the slave trade with Africans to the Americas and other parts of the world, as well as Europeans to various colonies. So we have large-scale migration streams that have dramatically changed the face of population geography. We also have a variety of ways of controlling migration. I just put some examples of the Great Wall, the Berlin Wall, the Korean DMZ zone, which is pictured here, and we have various types of migration and immigration laws. So migration, as I said, is probably one of the biggest factors, aside from just births and deaths, that determines the population geography of the world. So we're going to end here, and then we're going to continue with migration in the next PowerPoint.